In this video, we will learn top 10 rules about the pawn endgames, such as triangulation, key squares, opposition, and so on. We start with key squares. In king and pawn endgames, it is essential to promote your pawn to the queen or the rook as you wish and deliver checkmate later on. In order to achieve that, it is important to push the pawn all the way to d8 square, but obviously our enemy's king will be on the way. You need your king's support in these cases. For instance, if right now white decides to move the king far away from the action here and black just goes there, you can't promote the pawn by its own. Therefore, you need your king's help. How to deliver that? In order to promote the pawn to the queen, it is very important to control the key square, such as the promotion square, which is the d8 at the moment, and the square before that, which is d7 as well. So, right now, it is white to move, and both of these moves, king c6 and king e6, would win the game. For instance, if white decides to go for king e6, it depends what black responds. There is a move king e8, c7, and c8 also. If black decides to play king c7, now white has to play king e7. As you can see, white controls the key squares d6, d7, d8, and it will be very easy to promote the pawn to the queen. If black plays king c8, we would do the same. As you can see, all the key squares are covered. So the most challenging response for black is to play king e8, but in this scenario we can push d6, king goes to d8 and d7. Now it is black to move. I can't really go on e8 or c8 square, has to come up, and after king e7, white easily promotes the pawn to the queen. Also, it is possible to start with king c6 on the first move. There is really no difference, as long as you understand that if you have a chance, you have to play king c7, or you have to push d6, d7, and d8 to promote to the queen. Let's have a look at another example of the key squares. In this position, it is black to move and responds with king e7. In order to promote the pawn to the queen, as we already discussed, we need our king's help. But our king should try to control the key squares, such as f7 and f8. By playing the king on e5, it's really not going to happen. Therefore, you have to go with king g6 and trying to push the pawn forward. If black here responds with king f8, it is very important to play king f6 right now. After king f6, if black plays king g8, you can put the king on e7, which covers all the key squares, and if the king goes on e8, you can respond with king g7, followed by f5, f6, f7, f8, and white wins the game easily. Let's talk about another example, corresponding squares. This typically occurs in the pawn endgames, where it is essential to be controlling certain squares at the certain time. If you want to promote your pawn to the queen, you have an extra pawn, it is important to have your king in front of the pawn. Most of the time, if the pawn is standing either next to the king, if this pawn would be standing on e5, for instance, or if it stands in front of the king, it will be a drawn endgame. For instance, right now, white plays king c6, but the biggest problem what we're facing is king c8. White has to push the pawn on d7, black responds with king d8 and king d6, and it will be a draw. Because it's a stalemate, the king cannot go anywhere. Another alternative will be to try king e6, but it will lead to the same result. King e8 comes next, and after d7, king d8, king d6, and not much changes. If you'll try to stay around by playing king e5 or anything like that, there will be king d7. If king d5, black has to make the right decision, has to go on d8 square, not on e8 or c8. The biggest reason is that if king goes to e8, it allows white to get the opposition by playing king e6, which we're going to learn very soon. And if black plays king d8, now there's d7. In the previous position, it was white to move, and white was forced to play king d6, and it was a stalemate. But now it is black to move, forces to play king c7, white responds with king e7 followed by d8 queen. Therefore, it is very important to put the king in front of the pawn. So whenever you play king d8, it is impossible for white to play king d6. That's why it is extremely important that the pawn should not be standing in front of the king or next to the king. And now if white plays king c6, we'll respond with king c8, and if king e6, we're going to play king e8 with a peaceful result. This is the second example of corresponding squares, where it is black to move and black needs to decide where to put the king, on h7 or f7. Well, here the best move is to play king f7. Let's discuss about why king h7 is wrong. If you try even to bring the king backwards, and if you allow white to get 2 extra pawns, you're going to lose the game without any chance. So black here responds with king h7. If king goes on h7, white has several options, either push h5, f5, or bring the king on f6. Here, the reason why black loses the game is because there is h5, and after g takes, there is king takes h5, for instance, king g7, king g5, king f7, and king f5. It is very important to maintain the opposition right now, and depends where black moves. If the king goes on e7, we already know to play king g6 followed by king g7. If f8, you go with f6, and all you're trying to do is just to control the key squares. And if in this position black responds with king g7, you're going to play king e6, followed by king e7 next. Well, what happens if right now, for instance, white decides to push the pawn forward instead of putting the king in front of the king? In this scenario, as we already discussed, the pawn is standing next to the king, which automatically means that it's going to be a draw. Black has to respond with king g7, and white cannot make any other progress except pushing the pawn forward. After f6, king comes to f7, king f5, and where does the black king go? Yes, you guessed it right, it goes on f8. White cannot play king f6, therefore it will end up with a drawish position. Let's go back a little bit. So, in order to understand why king h7 was wrong, is because white maintains the opposition of the kings, which we are going to learn very soon, and this pawn easily can be promoted. But what happens if black plays king f7? It is important to understand that right now the move such as f5, which also looks like the same situation there, we are maintaining the opposition, and why not use the h pawn to promote it? You need to understand one fact, that the pawns from b file to g file, actually all the way from here, except the rook pawns, which are h and a pawns, will be winning. Most likely, depends on the situation, of course, but a and h pawns cannot get promoted if enemy's king can stop it. Because right now, no matter how hard you try to push the pawn forward, black easily will get a draw, because it will end up in a stalemate situation where you can't really do much. Therefore, the best move what black can play right now is king f7, because black doesn't fear f5 move. If white plays h5, g takes h5, king h5, and there is a strong move king f6, which forces white's king to get there, king g6, and as we already discussed, if the king stands next to the pawn, it's going to be a draw long term. So after king f7, f5 and h5 are not the only options. White can also try to bring the king up on h6, but in this case, black responds with king f6. White plays king h7. Here it is essential to not get greedy and trying to grab the pawns, because black loses the game in this scenario. White can play king g7, and it forces black to grab the pawn, king g6. And even though white still has this h pawn, as we discussed, it's most likely going to be a draw, white can actually push the pawn forward because black's king is not going to block it in front of it. Therefore, it is important to follow king f7. h5 doesn't work, you just take it. f5 doesn't work, you're not gonna take it. King h6, king f6, h7, f7, and you just literally go back and forth, and it will end up with a peaceful result. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to click like and subscribe, because whenever you reach 10,000 subscribers, there will be a free giveaway, the video courses from my website. Now let's talk about the opposition, one of the most important rules in chess. We know that in the endgames, the kings are very powerful pieces. You're trying to hide it in the openings and middle games, but in the endgames, it's time to activate because there are not many pieces left. Therefore, our king will have less danger. When you get pawn endgames, it is very important to have more active king and especially centralized king. Right now, if we'll play a game, for instance, that white's main goal will be to reach the 8th rank first. If the king actually crosses the 8th rank first, white wins the game. And if black crosses the 1st rank, black wins the game. Okay, so right now, if it is black to move, you see that At the moment, white's king cannot advance further because all the squares are occupied. But if it is black to move and goes with king d6, now we can play king f5. We are trying to reach our goal as soon as possible. If we will have a race like king d5, f6, for instance here, we will cross the 8th rank first, therefore white will win the game. So after king f5, black tries to stop this king by not getting closer to the 8th rank, and they can try king e7. White tries to seize the momentum again, king f8, king h7, and white easily achieves that. This all happened because white has a good opposition, and it is impossible to stop the king in these cases. If black responds with king d7, now you can play king d5. So there are two types of oppositions in chess. First is long and short. So short opposition here is when there is only one square in between the kings, as you can see right now, and long distance is either 3 squares, for instance, as you can see right now, 3 squares in between the kings, or even more advanced version when there are 5 squares. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you will get 2 squares or 4 squares in between, this is a wrong opposition. If black plays king e7 right now, and they can claim that, oh, my king is standing in front of my enemy's king, therefore it will be an opposition, it is wrong mindset, because if it is your opponent's move, they're going to play king e5, and now white is the one who actually controls it. Let's have a look at alternative reality, okay? If black goes for something like king f8, white makes a mistake, and king e8. If you play the same kind of game, that if you reach the 8th rank first and black gets to the 1st rank, just black wins if they get on the 1st rank, and you win if you get on the 8th rank. It becomes obvious that white has a huge advantage, and you're not going to lose the game, right? Because until black even reaches the 1st rank, you're gonna cross 8th by big margin. But actually, it will be simply a draw. You cannot win this battle. Please forget the fact that there are no pawns. Just focus on the kings only to understand the opposition rule very well. It is really essential. Because if you go king f6, black just responds with king f8 and is not allowing you to bring the king anywhere close. g6, g8, h6, h8. No matter how hard you try to get to the 8th rank, enemy's king is not allowing you to do that. Therefore, it will be a draw. So it doesn't matter how far advanced you are, as long as the kings are staring each other and you're in the situation where it's your opponent's move, then you are good to go. Let's have a look at more realistic position right now. It is white to move. The pawn goes into this direction. It is very important to play king e3 right here. It will be a big mistake to touch the pawn and go for something like e3. As we already discussed, if the pawn stands in front of the king or next to the king, it's going to be a draw. So here black plays king e4, and after king e2, where do we move the king? f5, e5, or d5? Always stand behind the pawn, which automatically means that white cannot play king e3, and it's going to be a draw. As we already mentioned, the same kind of scenario will be happening on the 8th rank as well, where white will be pushing e7, your king goes to e8, king e6, and it will be a stalemate. It is important to play king e3 right now. If white makes a big blunder and plays king f3, it allows black to play king f5. In order to make any kind of progress for white, you have to push the pawn forward. By pushing the pawn on e3 or e4, either you put it next to the king or in front of the king, which we already said is not going to win the game. If you try to go for something like king e3, I'll play king e5, d3, d5, and you're not going to make any progress at all. If you go very far away from the pawn, of course black seizes the momentum and plays king e4 immediately. Tries to get to e3 square and take the pawn as soon as possible. And if king d2, king d4, and well, it's going to be a draw. But what's the best move? We play king e3 first. Now let's check where black moves. So our goal, as we said, is just to bring the king as close as possible to the promotion square, control the key squares e7 and e8, and push our pawn forward as well. So right now, if black plays king d5, we follow with king f4. Black has to try to stand in front of the pawn, because if king goes for something like d4, you can actually easily start pushing the pawn forward without any troubles, therefore it is not really worth it. So if black plays king e6, white plays king e4, king goes to f6, right now instead of pushing e3, which is a big mistake, because when black plays king e6, we already know that it's going to be a draw. If you go king d4, king d6, and if you have to push the pawn forward, it's not gonna end up well for you. And right now the main technique is to play king d5. Let's say black goes king e7 and king e5. Please pay attention to the fact that white hasn't pushed the pawn yet. They're trying to activate the king as much as they can first. It is really important. Black goes king d7. Now we can play king f6. And if king d6, it is already time to start pushing the pawn forward. But if king goes to e8, all the way to e6, king d8, and now you can start pushing the pawn whenever your king already stands very well. And after king e8, we go e5. So if black plays king f8, we already know we need to put the king here in order to promote the pawn to the queen. And if king gets to d8, you will push the pawn very easily and white wins the game. Therefore, it is important to put the king on the right square, maintain the opposition, otherwise you will not win this kind of endgames. The next thing is the mine squares. These are the squares where none of the kings want to get there first. For instance, we play against white, materially it's equal, and obviously if we want to promote our own pawn, first of all we need to grab the pawn on e5. But you actually can't play king f5, because black here plays king d4, protecting the pawn and attacking the pawn on e4. This is actually zugzwang position, which we're going to study in the future. So after king d4, now white has to move the king away. Let's say on g5, king d4, and black easily wins this game. Well, it is a bad decision to go for king f5 right away. What should we do then? It's really much better to play king g5, with the idea of playing king f6, attacking the pawn on e5, and forcing black to get there on d4 square first. If now black plays d4, so d4 and f5 squares are mined. Whoever gets there first loses the game. As white goes king f5 now, and there is not much what black can do. White grabs the pawn and promotes the pawn in short notice. So after king j5, if black plays something similar like king c4, white can play a strong move king f6. We're not getting to f5 square yet. We attack the pawn on e5 and forcing black to play king d4. There's no time for king d3 because you're going to take the pawn. And if king d4, you go with king f5. Now black's king has to move from d4 square, and this position already will be winning. Well, it is important to understand that this position itself is not winning. You just need to understand the concept of f5 and d4 square. You might be surprised why. When you play these positions as black and you understand that you're going to lose the pawn, think about the king and pawn versus king endgames. So black's best response is king d6. Now for playing king f6, just give up the pawn and play king e7. And we already discussed that this is going to be a draw. So after king d5, you follow king d7. And if e5, you go king e7. And if the king follows, you're not going to do anything else until the pawn pushes. It's very important to put the king in front of the pawn. Now for king e8, these will end up with a drawish result. Next up, we have the triangulation. Yes, you heard it right. It's like a math. Exactly, we need to use the triangulation. Why do we need it? In the current position, you're playing as white. We have an extra pawn. But it is obvious that we cannot win with this f6 pawn, because as we discussed, it is standing in front of the king. So if white plays king d6, black responds with king e8, and in case of f7, king f8, king f6, it's going to be a stalemate, and white cannot win the game. And this pawn's existence on h5 and h6 doesn't change anything, because they are not going to move anywhere. So trying to push the pawn forward doesn't make much sense. If white tries to play king f5 followed by g6 and h6, try to grab the pawn with that way, it's not really the best thing what white can do, because after king f5 there is king f7. Black is not allowing white to get there. The only move is king e5 to still keep the pawn on the board, and black plays king f8. And we end up in the same kind of situation, king e6 and king e8. Now, in these kind of situations, I know it's a very weird question, but you still have to ask yourself, what if it is my opponent's move? In this scenario, white wins the game. So if black plays king e8, you can play king e6, king f8, f7, and if king g7, you go king e7 followed by promoting the pawn. If black plays king f7, it is actually a mine square. Nobody wants to get to f5 square first because there is king f7. And if king goes to f7, white can play king f5, forcing the enemy's king to go back and then trying to grab the second pawn. So, and in case of king g8, there will be king e6. So right now, the best thing what you can do is to do the triangulation. So you have to play king f4, e4, and e5. So you end up in the same situation after 3 moves. So So, but you have to be close to the f5 square, because whenever white plays king f7, you have to be able to play king f5. So f4, e4, and e5 squares are ideal for that because you're always standing nearby these squares. So white starts with king f4. What can black do? As we discussed, king f7 is a big mistake because it allows white to grab another pawn, and of course white wins the game. So after king f4, if black plays king e8, now we go with king e4. Again, f7 is a mistake because of king f5, and if the king goes back on f8, white plays king e5. And guess what? We ended up in the same position where it is black to move, which actually changes a lot. So after king e5, white's plan is to react on black's reaction. If black responds with king f7, white is going to get on g6. If king e8, there is king e6, f7, and king e7. Please, it is important to note that don't promote here to the queen because it will be a stalemate. Just play king f6 first, and after king h8, just promote to the queen right now and deliver mate as soon as possible. So why black could not do the same? Probably you're wondering. White used 3 moves to get to e5, but if black plays king e8, this is 1 move, king f8 and king e8, in 3 moves, the king, instead of being on f8, ends up on e8. The biggest problem why black cannot get to the same kind of rule like f7, e8, f8, trying to get in the same square, is because f7 is a mined square. If black ever gets there, white is going to play king f5 and play king g6. Therefore, white wins the game with this triangulation rule. Next up, we have king versus passed pawns. This is one of the most basic endgame what you can study. We already discussed that a pawns typically cannot get promoted if your enemy's king can stop it. The first thing what you need to look at is if your pawn can promote without any help. So do you really have to bring the king there? Maybe you can just run and black's king cannot stop it. So right now, white's best move will be to play a4. Always calculate if your enemy's king will be faster or not. There is one rule which is called like the king in the box, where you actually need to calculate how many squares you need. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you sort of need to make a box. If you see that your enemy's king is already inside, then they can stop the pawn. So for instance, if the king would have been on e5, black can stop it. But if it's outside of the box, you can promote it. But come on, let's be honest. When you're in time trouble, specifically in the pawn endgame, I assume if you play blitz game or over the more classical, you're not going to do some Pythagorean theorem here and trying to learn how many squares are there and so on. All you have to do is just to calculate if the pawn goes there, your enemy's king there on time or not. So no need really to learn this rule. It's really old-fashioned. Just calculate if you're on time. Because it gets extremely tricky if the pawn is standing in starting position, because it can jump in 2 squares. So actually the box is not going to be that relevant. So right now, if white plays a4, black responds with king f4. Always calculate these moves first. Maybe your pawn might be on time. And yes, white can promote on time. In the game, white actually made a big mistake, played king f1, thought it was time to bring the king closer. But by playing king f4, black's king is already inside the box, and if a4, black is on time to stop the pawn. Otherwise, white is not going to win this endgame, even if they maintain the opposition, because as we discussed, rook pawns, which are a and h pawns, will not win the game if enemy's king will be stopping them. Let's have a look at another beautiful example of king versus passed pawn created by Richard Reti. And it becomes very obvious that white is in trouble. This pawn goes into this direction, black wants to promote here. White's king is very far away from stopping the pawns. If white tries something like king g7, h4, this pawn is going to get promoted and there is not much what we can do. Also, we cannot use our c pawn, because if you push it, there is king b7, and again, the pawn will just get promoted. It is extremely rare case that this position can be saved by white, and all you have to do is just to try to stop the pawn and at the same time support your c pawn. So the best move to start is king g7. Black cannot just grab the pawn, because after king f6, here king c6, there is king g5, and white is actually on time to take black pawn. So this plan will fail. If black tries to push the pawn as far as possible until white tries their own some weird plans, there is king f6. h3, and there is the best move, king e7. Right now, white already gives up on stopping the pawn on the h file because the king is staying way far away from there. After king e7, if h2, c7. Tries to promote on c8, if king b7, king d7, and white actually promotes there. And if h1, c8, queen. We couldn't promote the pawn without our king's help. That's why you need to centralize the king first. You might be able to help your c-pawn or trying to grab the pawn on h2. Okay, after king f6, for instance, if h3, we already understand that there's king e7. If king b6, you can even play king d7 and the pawn gets promoted. But what happens if black tries to play king b6 right now? Because if you play king e6 or king e7 or e6, there will be king c6 and h-pawn gets promoted. Here the best move is king e5. So you're trying to get to f4 square and stop the pawn, and simultaneously king wants to get to d6 square to support its own pawn to promote. Right now, if black takes on c6, you're going to grab the pawn on f4 and it will be easily drawn. And if black responds with h3, you're going to play king d6 followed by c7 and c8, and there is not much what black can do. h2, c7, h1 queen, c8 queen, and the game will be drawn. Another example will be about two separated pawns. As you can see on the position, black has very powerful pawns on h4 and g3. Whenever black gets this kind of protected passed pawns, you cannot play the move such as king h3 followed by king h4, because if you try to take the pawn on h4, for instance, black goes king d4, king h4, there is g2, and you can't stop another pawn. But at the same time, black cannot push the pawns forward and obviously will not be able to promote them. So it is essential to understand that these two pawns will be blocking the king, but they cannot get promoted either. But we see that on the queen side here, e4 and a4 pawns versus the king on c4. You don't have the same kind of shield as black's pawns are protecting each other. So if it's black to move and they will go for king b4, a4, they can come back to another pawn, grab all these pawns, and of course with two extra pawns, it will be easily winning. So what should white do in these cases? You have to play very smart. If you start with the move like a5, which is obviously a good move, black needs to pay attention to that. Otherwise, if king comes to d4, white promotes the pawn to the queen very soon. So it distracts the enemy's king to get to b5, and whenever you see that your enemy's king went to one of the pawn to stop that, now you can push another. Push the pawn on e5. So if black tries to grab the pawn, there is e6, and black is not on time to stop the pawn on the e file. You just have an extra queen. And if king gets to c5, trying to stop the pawn, now you again push one of the pawn. Distract the king, and then push another. And at the end, black obviously cannot stop both of the pawns, one of them gets promoted. But it is important to notice that you should have minimum 3 files in between the pawns. In these cases, you will be able to win the game. But if there are less than 3, such as 2 squares, for instance, if white's pawn would have been on b4, you cannot win the game because it's going to be losing. Black will grab both of the pawns and it's just over. As I mentioned, let's have a look at this example. So now if you try to use the same trick, playing b5, black is exactly on time to grab both of the pawns. You go e5, king b5, because these pawns are really close to each other, and whenever black grabs this, with 2 extra pawns, as we discussed, it's easily winning. Let's move on to more advanced endgames. King versus 3 passed pawns. What is going on in this position? First of all, let's clarify that we have 2 passed pawns, and if black moves the king anywhere, it goes on c8, you can push a7 and promote the pawn. c7 will lead to the same, and if king gets to the a file, then another pawn gets. So black has a bit tough situation, king cannot move. The only way what they can do is just by pushing the pawns forward. But here comes the question, can king stop 3 passed pawns? 2, it can, because we have seen it in the previous example. 3 also is a possibility, but it is important to choose the right move from start. The best move is to play king g1, so the king stays 2 2 files away from the pawns. If you play a logical move such as king g2 trying to centralize the king, the big problem is that there is g3. For instance, white goes for king f3, h3, and white is in big trouble. h2 is coming and there is not a single thing what white can do about it, so pawn easily gets promoted. Therefore, you play king g1 and you see what black responds. If g3, you go king g2. None of these pawns can get pushed without getting captured, and as we discussed, the king cannot go anywhere because our pawns will get promoted. So for king g2, if f3, we take it with the king, and if black just pushes the pawns, we're going to take all of it, and it will be easy victory. And if here h3, of course, you take with king h3, and it's easily winning for white. This happens in case of g3. If black plays f3, it is important to put the king in front of the pawn, so you play king f2. g3 is not possible due to king f3 right here, and if black plays h3, you can put the king exactly in the middle of all these pawns. If h2, you're going to take it. If f2, he will take it as well. For example, f2 grabs it, h2, king g2, g3, and you just move the king back on h1. Black cannot push g2, they can't push h1, so it will be easily winning for white. If you want to see epic failures, big blunders by world champions, even missing checkmates in ones, check out this video.